So I didn't think the next time we'd crawl a dungeon in a video again was so soon after going through the numbered Etrian Odyssey titles. And I definitely wasn't expecting it to be with a recent release. But sometimes things line up just right and you shouldn't ignore it. So I hope you're all inked up and ready to go, because today we're going to crawl in the dark with the Labyrinth of Zangetsu. The Labyrinth of Zangetsu takes place in a ruined and desolate ancient Japan. All-consuming and corrupting fog made of ink has been spreading all over the lands, making the country uninhabitable. Everyone capable of fighting back has banded together in one small town, putting aside their past alliances and walks of life in what feels like humanity's last struggle. This is where you come in. You put together a team of 6 party members, 3 in the front, 3 in the back, and brave the dark and desolate dungeons to find the source of ink and stop it from flowing any further. It's kind of a throwaway plot to get you into the action, but as far as excuse plots go, this one is handled pretty well, since it plays very heavily into the monochromatic look of the game, which is probably the first thing that draws most people to this title, myself included. The moment it was announced for Steam, I'd wishlisted it for the visuals alone. It's incredibly striking. But it also sets up a few important things about team building and how the game functions. The Labyrinth of Zangetsu is very directly wizardry inspired, which also means you need to think about your party a bit differently than you would for most modern games. When putting your party together at the start, there's a couple of things you want to consider. The first is to not use the basic party members the game gives you. They're very mediocre. The developers didn't even give them actual names, they're just numbered 1 to 6. It's decent if you want to give the game a feel before you commit to rolling a full party of your own, a sort of demo session crew, but you don't want to push them any further than that. For a basic party, you'll want 3 strong front row characters who can take a hit without keeling over, and then in the back row 2 spellcasters, preferably 1 cleric to heal and 1 mage to deal damage. Having a thief with a ranged weapon there also adds some especially useful utility too. You can use any character portrait and most races for any role too, though elves obviously make the most sense for spellcasters, and I went with a Nekomata for my thief. You'll also want to re-roll repeatedly for decent bonus stats. The more, the better. Having enough bonus stats can help with picking better classes earlier instead of having to wait until you can multi-class into them. Though I don't think it's possible to immediately class into a paladin from the start. Having to repeatedly reroll for a decent stat is a bit annoying, but at least you don't have to repeatedly make new characters until the stats are just right. There aren't any particularly deep synergies or setups here. You kind of want characters performing certain roles especially well to cover your bases in terms of physical and magical attacks, as well as some utility. So I'm not going to go over the classes in depth. Zangetsu is very traditional with everything. Some might even say to a fault, because it does end up meaning that a lot of it feels basic if you're familiar with what it's pulling from. But I think that's intentional, as we'll get into later. So, once you put your party together, you enter the dungeon and, well, there's a tutorial dungeon first. A tutorial that seemingly references one of the meanest things that Wizardry 4 ever did. Wizardry 4 was a game aimed at wizardry experts. The first trilogy was known to be brutal, but if you knew how the games worked, you could dance around all the challenges and expertly clown your way through the game without much of a threat. If you've ever met one of those annoying people that brags about how deeply they understand the Souls games in the most aggressive way possible, think that, but worse somehow. So as a response, the developers very directly jabbed at the massive ego the players had built around how great they were at the game by putting in an absurdly unfair puzzle right in the first room of the game, and then packaging the game with a sealed letter containing the solution to the problem. Of course, you're so much of an expert, you're not going to break that seal and open up that letter, right? Even though the envelope's outer text is sitting there, taunting your inability to progress the first room of this newly bought game. It's a bit of a side note, but I want more people to know about this in general, because understanding this is to understand dungeon crawlers. Zangetsu never gets this mean. In fact, the room where the text seems to reference this moment isn't too hard to get past. But shortly after the tutorial text seems to reference Wiz 4's Darkest Hour, the game introduces a visibility mechanic, where you can't see in the dark until you use a torch or use a cleric to cast a light spell. So it really cannot be a coincidence. Once you get into the dungeon proper, things get a little more interesting. One of the more intriguing systems is that Zangetsu doesn't start off using random encounters. They do become a thing later on, and even then the encounter rate isn't especially high. But early on, all the encounters are fixed locations on the map. Giant ink clouds that take up an area. If you're wondering why they don't just take up one square in a hallway that you can walk past, well, there's a reason for that too. You can sneak past the ink clouds to skip encounters, though every step within an ink cloud is another chance you could get detected and drawn into battle. If you end up trying to run away from an encounter, you take one step back on the map, which, if you're several steps into an ink cloud, could immediately put you into another encounter. Once you've actually won the encounter, the ink cloud disappears until you leave the area, so they do respawn if you move between floors or go back to town. They're not just gone forever, though some of the special encounters do stay gone once you've cleared them up. So, let's clear the air of all that gushy ink and talk about combat. If you have any familiarity with wizardry at all, you're going to recognize these commands immediately, because we've got our traditional attack, 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 parry, parry, parry system in place here. At least, at the start of the game. The front row attacks and the back row parries to mitigate incoming damage. Later on, your mages will have enough spell slots to keep up the damage each turn without worrying about wasting good damage on small fries. And your third wheel freeloader, thief, will likely have a decent enough range weapon to join in on the fun. Once you've picked out your team's actions and confirm your turn, everyone's attacks play out in order of speed. Speaking of speed, combat flows very well in Zangetsu. There's no fluff, no overly long animations. Even without using the fast forward feature, the game moves at a very good pace. And with fast forward, the game moves at a faster clip than most games do if you fully turn off combat animations. It's a joy. Mages don't have MP, but instead use spell slots. Spell slots are separated into tiers, so casting a tier 1 mage spell won't take away any potential uses from a tier 2 spell or vice versa. Early on, when you only have access to 1 or 2 tiers, it feels a little stifling. But in the late game, you have way more freedom to cast your spells than you would with most MP systems. Damage calculations are very traditionally tabletop. So every hit, you've got your weapon strength along with your weapon's potential hit count per attack versus an armor class calculation. You don't have to be deeply familiar with how it works exactly to get too far into the game. Most of it is under the hood, and so long as you focus on the better number between what's available, you're fine. It also helps to check weapon proficiencies with classes, since classes can equip more weapon types, then they get passives to use efficiently. There is a good reason for that though, since the game features multi-classing. You also get your usual selection of status effects like paralysis, silence, and poison. They stay after encounters, which is kind of funny early on when there's no random encounters, so you can just safely walk them off. There's also a unique status effect in Zangetsu in the form of corruption. Basically the all-corrupting ink taking a toll on your party members. This is an HP debuff that stays in place until you get it purified at the temple. Getting purified is not a free action, they charge up front for this service. So when you get to the early to mid game, this can hit you quite hard for a variety of reasons because you're going to be destitute. Combat has 4 rows to it, 2 for both fighting parties. This also means that there's a difference between weapon types being able to hit 2 or 3 rows ahead of themselves, basically meaning some long-range weapons are meant for front row classes, or allow the back row classes to at least hit something without using a spell slot. It's a distinction, but not the deepest one. Some enemies show up shrouded in darkness. This is especially true for the ones in the back row. I'm not sure if it modifies their stats in any way, and the majority of enemies are easy enough to differentiate from one another with just their silhouette. So it's a cool mechanic, but it doesn't really change anything from what I've noticed. That said, I do love the monster designs in this game. They range from pretty cool looking to just whatever the fuck this little dude is. Though my favorite is probably the Lesser Demon. They look sick. Once you've killed all the enemies in a fight, you usually find a treasure chest. Treasure chests tend to be locked and trapped, so it helps to have a thief in the party to safely unlock them. If you don't open the chest, you're not getting any gold or items from the fight. You'll still get experience points at least, but your characters won't level up until you head back into town. So even if you'd rather have a third spellcaster in your party, having that thief taking a character slot pays for itself. literally. If your thief somehow messes up, or for whatever reason you're in a dungeon without one, you can always smash the chest open with one of your warriors. A good way to trigger any traps they have for sure. If you want to play it safe, you can always cast a spell from one of your casters to open up, but that takes resources, so it's not something you can constantly do. Unlike thieves who can freely attempt to open any chest they want, whenever they want. If you trigger any of the traps, the results can range from not all that bad to maybe one of the worst things a video game has done to me since Star Ocean 3's plot twist. Most traps just damage your team or give them status effects. Party-wide damage is easily dealt with by casting Party Heal, so it's not the worst thing that could happen. There's a few very bad effects though, like one that makes you redo the fight again. Though if you're trying to grind out some levels, this can be useful since you're going to get the EXP again. The real evil trap effect is the Butterfly's Dream. So, Labyrinth of Zangetsu uses autosaves. Whenever you enter the dungeon or head back into town, the game saves itself. Butterfly's Dream reloads your save file, putting you back at the start of the dungeon with all your progress made since that last save rendered undone. When this hit me the first time, I couldn't even comprehend what had just happened. I thought I'd been teleported back to the start of the dungeon until I realized I wasn't leveling up when I headed back into town, because I hadn't gained any experience points, and I had no items to sell. I'd opened up a shortcut and killed a mini-boss that run, and now I could do it all over again. I can imagine some people would have this happen to them and get so mad they stop playing right there, but all I could do was sit there in mild confusion before slowly growing some appreciation for how perfectly I'd just gotten pranked. Dungeon crawlers tend to play mean tricks on their players. It's what they do. A lot of the early FPS games had similar level design, where it feels like you're having a sort of back and forth with the map maker. And the map maker is an evil prankster trying to get under your skin, but you're okay with this. This is why John Romero is an exceptional map maker for Doom. By playing, you've signed up for this special back and forth. You've signed up for getting tricked and seeing through the tricks. I had never considered a video game would use quick saves like this. Rendering your whole dungeon crawl a dream, something that never happened. It's both so terrible and at the same time it is everything I love about video games. Especially because it could be worse. It could have killed my party and sent me back to town to save that event. That would have been a much bigger setback than just reloading my save file would have ever been. It's the difference between a minor prank and something actually malicious. Because characters who have died need to be resurrected, and resurrecting them costs money. A lot of it. Depending on what game mode you're playing, what happens when the full party wipes changes too. There's a very nice mode accommodating newer players that allows for you to reload your file upon death so you don't have to go through the actual intended experience of a party wipe, because the actual intended mode is something straight out of wizardry. If your party wipes, their corpses stay in the dungeon and you have to go retrieve them with another party. Also, the game immediately saves the fact that they all died, so you can't just reload your save file. That party's death is committed to the record and you'll have to live with it. Though you can just exit out of the game and reload your last autosave before everyone dies. It's the coward's way out of an option you didn't have to choose, but you could argue that this is also traditional, because people cheated their way out of wizardry automatically saving unfortunate data to your floppy by removing it from the drive as well. So yes, I will take having my save data reloaded and rendering my progress undone, because things could be so much worse. Besides, Labyrinth of Zangetsu moves at a breakneck speed. The most you could stand to lose is 20 minutes of progress. Dungeon runs are not super long most of the time, and you're likely going to be moving through a full cycle of exploration and combat encounters every minute. Even faster if you're fast forwarding the animations, and that in a game with an encounter rate that doesn't feel all that high. It's quite remarkable. Anyway, where were we? Alright, chests. Items retrieved from chests need to be identified before you can use them. This is something you can do in the field with a probability rate depending on class affinities with item types, though once you head back into town, everything you bring with you gets identified in bulk. After that, you can choose to put your newly found items in storage, or sell or equip them. Upon entering the town, all the characters who can level up will immediately do so too. Although their stat menu only shows the points until the first possible level up, they can still level up multiple times back to back. So you don't need to head back to town as soon as someone can increase their level. This is especially useful once you start multi-classing your characters. Multi-classing changes your character's class and puts their level back to 1. They tend to lose quite a chunk of their stats in the change too, but they're bound to come out of it stronger once you've leveled them up, especially since they'll keep all their abilities, both the passives and the combat-oriented attack skills. The classes that stand the most to gain from this are the spellcasters though. Starting out with both a mage and a cleric to both class them into a sage, so they can both do either magic type, while leaning towards the other especially well gives you two powerhouses that can keep the party moving forward. Another important part of the town is the temple. You can clear characters of corruption here, as well as resurrect the dead. Death comes in 2 phases in Zangetsu. If your character's HP hits 0 during combat, they get downed. If they are healed during combat or nothing else hits them before the end of it, they'll get back up on their feet. But if they get hit a second time, they're dead. Sometimes attacks hit so hard that middle knockout phase can get skipped too. A dead character needs to be brought back to town. Upon entering, they'll be removed from the party and be placed in the temple, where they can get resurrected, and this costs money. A lot of money. Money that you probably don't have early on. So you might want to be prepared to let some of your loved ones go, at least until you can afford to bring them back. Because of this, it also helps to keep some spare equipment in storage instead of selling it. You might actually need that extra armor on a new squishy unit to help power level them. Or at least, let them stand on their feet long enough to gather the gold needed to get your main characters back. Also, resurrection isn't a guarantee, so you could save up all that money, finally spend it, and then still not get your character back. You can retry as many times as you like, and the chance of failure is quite low, but that risk of it not working is always there. Later on, it doesn't matter all that much anymore. You're swimming in so much money that this aspect of the game is trivialized, but it's still an interesting experience early on. If there are any criticisms I really have, it's that I wish that Labyrinth of Zangetsu was a bit meaner. I really like the intricate design of the later areas, Kudaha's Temple Garden and Kudaha's Finger in particular. Temple Garden having a lot of one-way tiles and warps, Finger being this intricate multi-floor journey you zigzag through while trying to unlock shortcuts and figure out the warp paths. But that's also the last proper dungeon of the game. The combat itself stays fairly basic too, which doesn't mean that it's overly easy. Some enemy encounters can absolutely demolish you if you're not careful, and they will do so while ambushing you and taking you down on the first turn. But there's never any especially deep strategy involved with taking any enemies down. Though, this is all by design. Labyrinth of Zangetsu is very clearly intended to be an introductory course to classic dungeon crawling RPG conventions, and I think it does an especially good job at this. What you're basically getting is an easier wizardry game, with all of its conventions and language, but without some of the dirtier tricks Wiz is going to throw at you, and with some modern quality of life added in. It's the perfect game if you're unsure about being able to go back to older dungeon crawlers, because if you can play this, you can at the very least play the PlayStation 1 port of the original Wizardry trilogy. Don't be fooled by that being a Japanese-only release, you can set it to English in the settings. So, do I recommend Labyrinth of Zangetsu? Yeah, kind of. It depends on what you want, really. For people deep into the genre, it might be a bit too simple and bare bones, and for those in the shallow end of RPG appreciation, this might actually still be too rough. But I'm sure there are people out there for who this is just right. If it looks interesting to you, give it a spin. Also, be sure to give the music a listen. There was no upload for this on YouTube or anywhere else, so I recorded the in-game audio and uploaded a chunk of the soundtrack myself to the other channel. There will be a link in the description and a pinned comment with a link to it. And thank you to the publisher, PQCube, for the review code. I usually don't take offered review codes for games, but this is one that I already had interest in and was considering to maybe cover at some point, so it would have felt very wrong to say no to this. And I'm thankful they were okay with me taking my time with it, because I was offered this while working on the Minstrel Song video. It was interesting going from building one true party-o game in Minstrel Song to frequently having to swap characters in and out, changing their classes over time. So, that being said, I asked the people supporting the channel on Patreon what they prefer, honing the skills of one set party with fixed classes, making them more efficient over time, or frequently swapping between a larger set with limited availability. Freeform won, which, yeah, I can kinda agree with that. Variety is very nice to have. Next time, we're going to start resurrecting an old love and building a bunch of towns in the progress. As always, this video was brought to you by the people supporting the channel on Patreon. If you'd like to become one of the names that you see scrolling on the screen right now and vote in future polls, head over to patreon.com/AboveUp or become a channel member, and I will, see ya.